Do you have to go to church to be a Christian? How many times? Right? Like, what's the minimum amount of times I can go to church and still be called a Christian? Right? Like, if I went when I was a kid, is that enough? Right? I put in a lot of years, right? What's the limit on a good excuse for skipping church? Right? Like, if I'm sleepy, is that a good enough reason to skip church? Or what, do I have to be like missing a limb and gushing blood for it to be acceptable for me to miss the Lord's day? What is this thing that we do in this place every single week? I think for a long time, the church has pushed people towards a set of rules. Do this, don't do that. Say this, don't say that. But that set of rules has failed to capture the heart of God's people. And so today, we're going to look at the church and we're going to ask why. Why do we go to church? Why do we read our Bibles? Why do we give money or volunteer our time? Why do we do this thing that we do in this place? You know, the struggle of authenticity in church attendance, it reminds me of a story I read this past week of a pastor. And the pastor, he was an avid sports fan all his life. Every season he got super excited. It's baseball season. All right, now it's football season. All right, now it's hockey season. He got really excited. Year round, he had something to watch. But one day he posted on Facebook and he said, "I've had it. I'm going to quit this sports business once and for all. You're not going to catch me near one of those places again." Do you know why? Well, I'll tell you why. And this is what he wrote. He says, "Every time I go into a sports arena, they ask me for money. And every time the people I got to sit with, they don't seem very friendly. And the seats are too hard. They're not very comfortable. I went to so many games, but the coach never called me at home to say thank you for coming. The referee made a decision which I could not agree with. I suspect I was sitting with some hypocrites. There are people in that crowd who were only there to have fun and see what their friends were wearing and to eat the food. They didn't even care about the game. Some of the games went into overtime, and that made me late for my next thing. The band that played before the game, they played some songs I'd never heard before, and the games were scheduled during times when I wanted to do other stuff. I was taken to too many games as a child by my parents when I was growing up. I don't want to take my children to any games. I want them to choose for themselves what sort of sport they might like." Today, we are continuing our study in the chronological Bible. Now, I always like to sprinkle in these reminders. Number one, we are reading the Bible as a church. We're reading the whole Bible in a year, and that's a lot. Like, that's a really fast pace to read. And so we're covering a lot of ground. So what you get in the sermon on Sunday, we're going to pull out the big themes, right? We're like skimming along the surface, but these are deep waters. The Bible has so much for us to learn. And so if you're just joining us for the first time, you don't have to play catch up. That's okay. You can dive right in. But you always get more out of it the longer you study. And if you want to dive deeper, we have these chronological Bible studies that meet throughout the week. We have 3 of them, I think, right now. There's some on Tuesday. There's some right after service. So don't hesitate to ask if you would like to join us in the chronological Bible. I will put a Bible in your hand today so you can take it with you. Now, this past week, our readings in the study was almost entirely in the book of Psalms. Now, for those who don't know, Psalms is this massive collection of poetry written by kings who are just pouring out their heart to God in celebration and in struggle. And so what I'd like to do today is I'm going to drill down into Psalm 118. So if you've got a Bible, Psalm 118 is where we're going to be mostly. Now, I love the passage that I read for y'all earlier, but I want to go all the way back to verse 1. The whole chapter of 118 is good stuff. So it says in verse 1, it says, Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His faithful love endures forever. Let all of Israel repeat, his faithful love endures forever. Let Aaron's descendants, the priests, repeat, his faithful love endures forever. Let all who fear the Lord repeat, his faithful love endures forever. You know how sometimes people complain that contemporary Christian music is a little repetitive? Yeah. Let's keep reading. Did you ever wonder, though? Do you wonder why there are parts of the Bible that are so repetitive? Like, why are they saying it over and over and over? Was one time not enough? Let's keep reading. He says, in my distress, I prayed to the Lord, and the Lord answered me and set me free. The Lord is for me, so I have no fear. What can mere people do to me? Yes, the Lord is for me. He will help me. I will look in triumph at those who hate me. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in the people. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in princes. It says, in my distress, I call out to God. See, here's the thing. There are certain things that get repeated over and over in the Bible. Like that line, his faithful love endures forever. And the reason that it gets repeated over and over is that humans have forgetful hearts. We have the memory of a goldfish, right? Our hearts are so forgetful. And honestly, that's the source of most of our insecurity. I mean, if you look at Israel's history, right, they will witness the 10 plagues of Egypt. They watch God part the Red Sea. They travel across on the dry line. They see these awesome miracles. And then 30 seconds later, they're like, yeah, but does God really love us? Right? Is he really going to take care of it? I know he parted the Red Sea, but does he really love us? How many times in our lives have people around us showed us that they love us? How many times have people proven themselves to us, and then 30 seconds later we go, yeah, but do they really love me? Are they really in my corner? The human heart is so forgetful. So we need reminders. Think about it this time. Think about it this way. How many times do you have to say, I love you to your spouse or to your children? Can you just say it the one time at the wedding and be good? Right? If you just say, I love you the one time, is that it? I already told you, right? Or even if you're not one of those mushy people that says it 20 times a day, side note, I'm one of the mushy people. I use I love you like a comma. My children hear it constantly, all day, every day, right? But even if you don't say it a bunch, you're not like one of those mushy people. Even if you don't, you've got to show it. Right? You have to demonstrate it with your acts of service. You've got to say your love and show your love over and over to keep a relationship alive. So now let's go back to our original question. Do you have to go to church? Do you see it? Let me give you another example. I do this all the time with premarital counseling. When I've got a young couple that wants to get married, and I'm talking to them, they're ready to get married, I ask them, if I take a flower that's in a pot, and I water it one time, and then I go stick it in the closet, what's going to happen? Is it good? I gave it water. It's going to shrivel up and die. Same thing happens in your marriage. If you water your husband one time and stick him in the closet, he's going to shrivel up and die. And the same thing is true for our love. If you feed it one time and expect it to last forever, it will shrivel up and die. And so my point when I'm talking to these young couples is that you got to continue to date one another when you're married, right? The wedding is not a finish line, right? You have to continue to pour into your relationship to keep it alive. Now let's go back to that question of how often we go to church. You see it, right? We need the church because our hearts are so forgetful. We need to gather in this place to be reminded that we are loved by God, and we need to express our love for God. It keeps going in verse 10, and it says, though hostile nations surrounded me, I destroyed them all with the authority of the Lord. Yes, they surrounded me and attacked me, but I destroyed them all with the authority of the Lord. They swarmed around me like bees. They blazed against me like a crackling fire, but I destroyed them all with the authority of the Lord. My enemies did their best to kill me, but the Lord rescued me. The Lord is my strength and my song. He has given me victory. Now, I want you to pick up on this, okay? You saw the repetition, right? Again, the repeating over and over. I destroyed them with the authority of the Lord. Scripture repeats itself because our hearts are forgetful. I think we forget that God is going to fight for us. God destroys the evils that are around us and the things that are oppressing and overwhelming us. But the second thing I want you to grab onto is the idea of an enemy. Right? Because a lot of these Psalms are written by King David or other kings, and David's a military leader. So he uses all this imagery of fighting in military battles, enemies at the gate, hostile nations surrounding me with weapons. But this is poetry, right? The book of Psalms is poetry. I don't know about you, I have never in my life, not even once, worried about enemies surrounding me. right? I live in Freeland, like it's a nice, safe community. I'm never worried about being surrounded, right? I don't have to worry about hostile nations when I'm driving up Tittabawassee on my way to Aldi to get groceries. I just don't live that life that they lived, right? And so in Freeland, there's this little store, it's called Pat's, and it's like kind of a catch-all. It has everything. Anytime I need something, I'll go to Pat's, right? It's right by my house, and every time I go to Pat's, I don't have to think, boy, I'm on my way to Pat's. I better worry about being surrounded by a swarm of bees, right? Or whatever he said, a crackling fire that's surrounded. It's just not something I worry about. We don't deal with the same types of threats as the ancient poets did. But that's the beautiful thing about poetry. That's how it works. They use imagery and visuals to give you the same idea. Maybe I don't fight off military enemies in my life, but in the modern world, we have completely different enemies that surround us. Have you ever read these things and you're like, I get it? Even though I've never been surrounded by a military, I get what it feels like to be totally overwhelmed. To be completely like, I'm totally surrounded and crushed and oppressed on all sides. To be surprised by noises. I know what it's like. During the pandemic, there was a lot of psychological studies that went around. As a culture, it was the weirdest thing. All of us went through the same thing. Doesn't matter like what color your skin is or how wealthy you were or whether you're a man or a woman or where you live. Everyone in the whole world went through the same thing together, right? Like we all went through this pandemic and we got locked into our homes and we're still dealing with the effects of that, right? We're still trying to figure that out. And there were a lot of studies and there was something fascinating I wanted to show you. The pandemic was in 2020. And during that time, the difference in suicide, drug use, alcohol, and anxiety skyrocketed. In 1 year, all that substance abuse skyrocketed. In 2021, anxiety rates of those who were polled in this study went from 6% to 35%. 6% all the way up to 35%. Drug overdose and suicide became the leading cause of death for people ages 15 to 44. In 2021, 37% of high school students reported poor mental health. 44% reported that they felt persistently sad and hopeless in the past year. Now, I can keep going through all this data, but I think you get the idea. Now, here's the important part. They measured these stats for people who had a regular involvement in a faith community. We all went through the pandemic, but what they found is that people who were connected to a church, who had regular involvement in a faith community, they still struggled like everybody did, but they came out significantly more emotionally healthy than those who did not. The study cites that regular involvement in faith community results in lower levels of worry, lower levels of fear, and lower levels of sadness. And it was directly related. The greater your private religious activities, religious attendance, and spiritual growth, the lower your level of worry, fear, and sadness. I'm not saying that we didn't struggle as a church, right? Everybody went through some struggles. But to do it without the church would have been even worse. Our culture is so stressed. They're so afraid, hopeless, even suicidal. But studies have shown again and again that religious involvement lowers fear, lowers worry, and even lowers sadness. It's a fairly simple picture. Your walk with God, it's too important. And the world is too messed up and broken and crazy to have this back burner mentality. We need the church because God fights for us. And one more quick note on that. I know some people will pull back from the church with this idea that they are not presentable. Have you ever had that, right? There's this idea that the church is for people who have it all together, right? Church is for people who are already fixed, right? They're like, I got to get my stuff together before I can go to church. I had a friend who was a parent of little kids. This was years ago. And they told me, they said, my kids are so loud and they're so noisy right now. We'll be back to church in a couple years. And it kind of broke my heart for two reasons. Number one, no, you're not. You're not going to be back in a couple of years. And number two, who told you you were not welcome when you were loud and messy? Who told you that? Who told you you needed to fix your life before Jesus would love you? Who told you you needed to get all your stuff together before you could walk into this church? Who lied to you? To use that old line, this is not a museum for perfect people. This is a hospital for the broken. Have you heard that? That's from an old poem. It came out like 15 years ago. It's such a good line. We come into this place, we are bleeding, we are messy and loud, and we find healing in this place. We need the church because our hearts are forgetful. We need the church because God will fight for us. You are here not because you have it all figured out. You are here to figure it out. Come messy, and you will find a God who is full of healing. Let me say that again. Come messy. That should be our invitation to our neighbors, right? They're like, oh, I got to fix my life. I got to clean myself up before I come to church. No, come messy. Come messy. And you will find a God who will clean you up. You will find a God of healing. And that leads us right to the next section. I love this chapter. I love the way it rounds out in the last part in verse 19. Chapter 118, verse 19, it says, open for me the gates where the righteous enter. I will go in and thank the Lord. These gates lead to the presence of the Lord, and the godly enter there. I thank you for answering my prayer and giving me victory. We come to church because these gates lead us into God's presence. But then it doesn't stop there. Verse 22. It says, the stone that the builders rejected has now become the cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing, and it is wonderful to see. Now that phrase, I want you to remember it. The stone that the builders rejected is now become the cornerstone. This is Psalms. This is hundreds of years before Jesus showed up. But then in Acts chapter 4, verse 11, for Jesus is the one referred to in the scriptures where it says, the stone that you builders rejected has now become the cornerstone. And then let me make sure I found it. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 6 and 7. 2 verses 6 and 7. As the scriptures say, I am placing a cornerstone in Jerusalem chosen for great honor, and anyone who trusts in him will never be disgraced. You who trust in him recognize the honor God has given him. For those who reject him, the stone that the builders rejected has now become the cornerstone. You see it? It's over and over. The cornerstone is Jesus. Jesus is the cornerstone. Now, I don't know if you need me to connect the dots, but I'm going to do it anyways. We call these Psalms, the ones we read this past week, we call them the Pilgrim Psalms. And we talk about that because we're taking a pilgrimage up to Jerusalem. These Psalms are all about Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the high place. And the reason we talk about Jerusalem is because that's where God was. Right? That's how they understood God's presence. They're like, you go to Jerusalem to connect to God. That's where the temple was. That's where Jesus was. And so for us in the modern world, that's the church. The church is the dwelling place of God. But I want to be very careful with how you hear that. Okay, think about this. We don't have God stashed somewhere in the back, right? There's no like secret button where the cross pops out and there's a little cubby back there for Jesus. That's not how it works. We come into this place to connect to God. This is where we find Jesus, but there's nothing magic about this building. The psalm talks about the cornerstone being rejected, but who is the cornerstone? Jesus. It's a person. It's not a building. It's not about bricks and mortar. We find out the cornerstone is Jesus. It's not about bricks and mortar. It's about the person of Jesus. And the same is true for us. The church is not a building. The church is not a worship experience. The church is the people. Aldersgate Church burns down tomorrow. Nothing has happened to this church. Does that make sense? The building doesn't matter. None of the buildings matter. The church is the people, and it always has been. If somebody comes to you and says, well, I don't need to go to church, I don't think you understand what church is. Because it's not about the place, it's the people. We need the church because our hearts are forgetful. We need the church because God fights for us. And we need the church because it is the cornerstone of an abundant life. The good news today is that God has given us the church. To be a Christian is not just a set of beliefs, and it's not just a set of good behaviors. It is both of those things. It's the beliefs up in your head and the way you live that out. And to do that, you need other believers to work out your faith with fear and trembling, like it says in Philippians 2. It doesn't matter how many Sundays you are here or not here, because it's not about the building. It's about you and your connection to God, to the people around you. Look, at the end of all things, when you stand in front of God on judgment, he's not going to ask you what your attendance ratio was. He is going to ask you, did you love my people? Did you live in community and love people? And that's really hard to do if you're not here. Christianity is a team sport. You can't love by yourself. You cannot love alone. The church is God's gift to help us put our faith into action. That's why we have the church. So if you are physically capable, yes, you gotta be in church every Sunday, because every Sunday is an opportunity for us to grow and love. You know, the Bible, there's this metaphor in the Bible where it talks about a woman getting married. And she's going to be a bride, and she's been promised to a good man. They got betrothed, and then before the wedding, she runs away, and she tears her dress, and she does terrible things. She cheats on the groom. She's looking for love in all the wrong places. She makes a lot of mistakes, and when she is exhausted and broken and filthy, it says her dress is practically destroyed. It's rags on her shoulders. In that moment, her husband comes for her. She does not deserve forgiveness, right? She abandoned the groom. She does not deserve, but the husband comes. He wipes away her tears. He lifts her out of the dirt. He cleans her off. He gives her a new dress, and he gets her ready for her wedding day. And the passage, the Bible, the woman the Bible is talking about is the church, and the good man is Jesus. In each of our lives, we have made mistakes. We have torn our dress. We have done terrible things chasing other gods, money, power, you name it, whatever it is. We come to Jesus as we are, a broken mess, and he washes us clean. Jesus wipes away our tears, wipes away the mud, lifts us out of the darkness, forgives our sins, and gives us a second chance. The church is not an institution. It's not a building or even a collection of buildings. The church is the people, the broken people who have run away from God, come home, and been forgiven by Jesus. That's what the church is. The church is a picture of God's grace. The Pilgrim Psalms highlight the value of the church, the need for the church and Christian community in our faith walk. And so I have two challenges for you, week. Number one, this is my first challenge for you: go to church. Make church a priority in your life. I once had somebody tell me, well, I don't need to go to church. I already have the beliefs, right? Like, I already know all the stuff they're going to teach me. I already got it. I have the beliefs, so I don't need to go to church. But Christianity is a team sport. And our hearts are forgetful. We need other people to exercise our faith. We need reminders because we're so quick to forget about God's love. I say some variation of God loves you like every single week. You keep coming, I'm going to keep telling you God loves you. I'm going to remind you of that every week. And I used to worry. When I started as a pastor, I was like, geez, I really don't have that much to say. I just have like the same thing that I keep telling people over and over. I've been doing this for 9 years. Nobody's sick of it yet. Because every week I need that reminder because I forgot, or the world told me God didn't love me. And so I need that reminder. I tell my children, it makes sense, right? Because I tell my children that I love them 100 times a day. And I tell my wife even more than that. It's amazing she's not sick of me. She might be. I once had a conversation with a lady. She said, I went to church every week, twice a week for 35 years, the whole first half of my life. I think I stocked up enough credits. It's just like my buddy who said he got the beliefs right? This lady had the opposite problem. She's like, well, I got the actions right. Isn't that enough? But you don't clean your house once and expect it to stay clean. You don't feed your children once and expect them to stay full. You don't show up for somebody one time and expect them to feel your love for a lifetime. A relationship with God requires regular meetups. To be a Christian means that you have a place where you can live out your faith in community with other believers. And to help us with that, God has given us the church. So go to church and bring the family. Now, my second challenge for you, and the last thing that I'm going to say, first, go to church. Second, be the church. Be together. as broken people, loving each other, encouraging and motivating each other to love God more. Live in tension with one another. Challenge each other. Be challenged. Grow and learn and live together as the family of God, as the bride of Christ. Check this out. Hebrews chapter 10. This is a beautiful picture. I love these verses. I used to read them all the time. Hebrews chapter 10, verses 23 through 25. It says, "Let us hold tightly without wavering to the hope we affirm, for God can be trusted to keep his promise. Let us think of ways to motivate one another to acts of love and good works. Let us not neglect our meeting together as some people do, but encourage one another, especially now that the day of his return is drawing near." This is his advice to the church. He says, let us think of ways to motivate each other to do good work, to do acts of love and good works. I had a buddy in my first church. I was a little church up in the UP, and I had a buddy in my first church, and he was a hunter. He loved being out in the woods. They call it camp. When they're going out to the deer blind or whatever, that's what they call camp. So they go out there, and he was out there every time. If he didn't have work or family stuff, he was out in the woods shooting stuff, right? Like that was his whole thing. He loved it, particularly deer hunting season. Now, I should mention up there, the church cuts itself in half every November 15th, right? Like that's normal. That's just everybody's out in the woods. And there's nothing wrong with hunting, with being out in nature, spending time in God's beautiful creation. I love that. And he came to me, he's like, I just feel so close to God out there. And I told him, that's amazing. Like, I'm so glad that you have that close connection with God. I want you to have those experiences, to be closer to God. That's incredible. But you can't love your neighbor out there by yourself, right? You can't motivate or encourage somebody else. You can't love without another person. Christianity is a team sport. So we need to go to church and we need to be the church. So let's go all the way back to the very beginning. Do you have to go to church to be a good Christian? No, it's so much more than that. We need the church because our hearts are forgetful and we need the reminder. We need the church because God fights for us. And whatever troubles lay heavy on our hearts, we need the church because Jesus is the cornerstone of an abundant life. You don't just go to church. You are the church.